Picture this. A young man stands at the edge of a river in southern China, his pockets full of stones. He is 23 years old. He has just destroyed his doctoral thesis. 5 years of work, page by page, feeding it to the current. His professors called him one of the most brilliant chemistry students they had ever trained. His father had mortgaged the family's future to send him to America. And now he is standing at the water's edge, deciding whether to step in. He does not step in. But what happens next? The path he chooses instead will ignite one of the most extraordinary and most costly revivals Asia has ever seen. And the price he paid, the thing that never made it into the sermons preached about him, the thing nobody talked about at his funeral. That is what this story is really about. His name was Liang Bo-wen. He was born in 1901 in a small coastal city in Fujian province, the fourth son of a Methodist pastor who smelled of pipe tobacco and spoke with the cadence of someone who genuinely believed every word he said. Bo-wen grew up watching his father preach to congregations of fishermen and merchants and opium addicts who stumbled in from the harbor streets. He watched people weep. He watched people change. He watched his father come home afterward and eat cold rice alone at a table in the dark because there was never quite enough food and the pastor always made sure his congregation ate first. Bo-wen learned early that faith was not a comfortable thing. He was small for his age, bookish, with a slight stammer that made school a daily negotiation with humiliation. Other boys mocked him. He learned to go quiet. He learned to disappear into books, into mathematics, into the orderly world of chemical equations, where everything had a reason and nothing was arbitrary. By the time he was 16, his teachers were sending letters home saying they had never seen a mind like his. By the time he was 19, a missionary from Ohio named Dr. Ellsworth had arranged a scholarship for him to study at a university in the United States. He sailed for America in the autumn of 1920. He would not return to China for 7 years, and when he did, he would be a completely different man. The Ohio years were good to him in the ways that matter on paper. His English sharpened fast. His professors loved him. He earned his bachelor's in 3 years, then entered the doctoral program in organic chemistry. He published papers. He won a departmental award. A professor's daughter named Margaret took an interest in him, and for a while Bo-wen let himself imagine a future that looked like the futures other young men around him were building: a house, a laboratory, a career, a quiet life. But something was wrong underneath all of it. He had stopped praying, not dramatically, not with any decisive moment of rejection. He had simply gotten busy, and then busyness had become habit, and then habit had become a kind of spiritual numbness that he did not notice at first because the numbness felt so much like peace. He attended church occasionally. He sang the hymns. He shook hands with the minister. But the God he had watched his father serve, the one who showed up in the faces of weeping fishermen, the one who turned opium addicts into men who came back every Sunday and sat in the front row, that God felt very far away. And then, in the spring of 1927, during his 6th year in America, Bo-wen got sick. It started as fatigue, then fever, then something that the university physician kept calling nervous exhaustion, in a tone that suggested he wasn't entirely sure what it was. Bo-wen spent 6 weeks in the campus infirmary. He lost weight he did not have to lose. There were nights when the fever ran so high he could not remember where he was, nights when he called out in Fujianese for his mother, and woke to find a nurse from Indiana standing over him with a cool cloth and a confused expression. He survived, but the illness did something to him. Lying in that infirmary, in the long empty hours between the physician's visits, Bo-wen began to pray for the first time in years. Not the careful, structured prayers of a pastor's son who knew the right words. Something rawer than that. Something that felt more like a man grabbing the collar of someone he is not entirely sure is there. He prayed because he had nothing else left to do. And in that room, in that weakness, something answered. He could not explain it then, and he could not explain it later when he tried to describe it in sermons that left audiences weeping across 4 continents. He said only that it was like a door opening in a house he had lived in for years, without knowing the door existed. He said it was like coming home to a place you have never been. He said that whatever he had been searching for in chemistry, in academia, in the careful construction of an American future, he found it in that room. In the fever, in the dark, He walked out of the infirmary 6 weeks later and went directly to the head of the chemistry department and withdrew from the doctoral program. He destroyed his thesis on the way to the river. He returned to China in the summer of 1927 with nothing but a Bible, a small suitcase, and what he later described as a fire I did not know how to put down. His father met him at the dock. The old man looked at his son, thinner than he had left, eyes different, something burning in them, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he put his arms around him and held him the way fathers hold sons when they understand something that cannot be said. Bo-wen's mother cried. His brothers thought he had lost his mind. He probably had in all the ways that mattered. He began preaching almost immediately. Small meetings at first, a few dozen people in a church hall, then a village outside the city, then a riverboat that stopped at 3 towns along the Fujian coast. He preached with his stammer, and somehow this made people lean forward rather than away. He was not polished, he was not theatrical. He had none of the practiced authority of the missionaries he had watched as a boy, the ones who came from England and America, and stood at pulpits with the confidence of men who owned the room. He stood at the front of those small halls looking like exactly what he was. A young man from Fujian who had gone to America and come back carrying something he could barely contain. And the sick began to get well. He never sought this. That is the thing people who study Bo-wen's ministry always note first and always struggle to explain. He did not build a healing ministry. He did not advertise. He did not set up crusades with advanced teams and printed programs and ushers stationed at the doors. He simply went where he was invited, preached what he had seen in that infirmary room, and invited people to bring whatever they were carrying to the front. The first documented healing was a woman in her 50s in a village outside Fuzhou, who had been unable to walk without support for 11 years following a bone disease. She walked out of the meeting. There were 40 witnesses. Word traveled. Then it was a child in Amoy, with a condition doctors had told his parents was permanent. Then an elderly man in Shanghai who had been deaf in one ear since a childhood illness. Then, in a meeting in Hangzhou in the spring of 1929, a woman with a visible goiter who asked Bo-wen to pray for her and returned the following morning with her neck entirely smooth. By 1930, he was being invited to hold meetings across eastern China. Thousands were coming. Stories were coming back that Bo-wen himself could not always verify, reports of healings in villages where he had preached once and never returned, reports of whole families abandoning their ancestral shrines, reports of local officials showing up at meetings in ordinary clothes to see what was happening. He was 30 years old. He had not slept a full night in 3 years, and he had not told anyone about the other thing, the cost that was quietly accumulating in a ledger nobody could see. The loneliness was not something he talked about. This is important to understand. Bo-wen was not a melancholy man. He was warm, quick to laugh, interested in people in the way that certain individuals are genuinely interested. Not performing interest, but actually curious about the specific weight of the specific life in front of them. In meetings, he was known to stop mid-sermon and spend 20 minutes talking with one person in the crowd because something in their face told him there was a story there that needed to come out. He remembered names, he sent letters, he visited the sick, not just to pray for them, but to sit with them. But the revival had swallowed his private life whole. He was never in one place long enough to build anything. Friendships formed, and then he was gone. The few times he allowed himself to feel something approaching romantic love, the work of the revival swept him away before it could go anywhere. Or the woman in question looked at the life he was living and made a wise decision that Bo-wen never blamed her for. He wrote in his diary in the autumn of 1931, "I gave God everything he asked for. I do not regret this. But sometimes in the night I think about a table with 2 chairs, and I have to give that to him too. He gave it. Every time. But it cost him every time. There were mornings when he woke in a guest room in a stranger's house, in a city he had barely slept in, and did not know for a moment where he was. There were evenings after meetings, when thousands had been moved, and the room was still humming with something electric, and he would slip out the back and sit alone in a courtyard or an alley and feel a silence inside himself that was not the comfortable silence of a man at rest. It was the silence of a house with no one in it. He carried it. He never put it down in public. He never mentioned it from the pulpit. He considered it part of the price, and he paid it without asking anyone else to witness the payment. In 1932, he went to Southeast Asia. This decision was not strategic. A letter came from a pastor in Singapore who had heard of the Fujian meetings. Bo-wen prayed about it for 3 days, and then booked passage on a ship. He arrived in Singapore in February and stayed for 6 weeks, preaching in Chinese dialect churches to crowded rooms of immigrants from Fujian and Guangdong, who had brought their homesickness with them across the South China Sea, then Malaysia, then the Dutch East Indies, then back to China briefly, then to the Philippines, then to Japan, where he preached through interpreters in churches that could hold 200 people and somehow fit 600, then to Korea, where the memory of the 1907 Pyongyang revival still lived in the bones of the older believers, and they recognized immediately what they were seeing. The numbers became impossible to track. Local church records in Fujian alone showed more than 40,000 members added between 1928 and 1935 who traced their conversion to meetings connected to Bo-wen's ministry. The Malaysia records showed 16,000. The Singapore records showed 11,000. These are conservative estimates. The actual number, whatever it was, is somewhere in the region of what historians of the Chinese church have quietly called one of the most significant grassroots revivals of the 20th century. Bo-wen did not keep count. He said counting was God's business. The breakdown came in 1936. He had been traveling nearly without stop for 9 years. He had crossed the Pacific twice more on preaching tours that took him to Chinese immigrant communities in California, in Hawaii, in British Columbia. He had preached in languages he did not speak. He had fasted so often and so long that his body had begun to register its objections in ways that could no longer be ignored. Heart palpitations, episodes of complete physical exhaustion that left him unable to stand, a persistent weakness in his hands that made holding a Bible difficult. A physician in Hong Kong, after examining him, told him plainly that he was killing himself. Bo-wen thanked him and preached in Kowloon that evening. But the truth was breaking through in other ways. The diary entries from 1936 are hard to read, not because he had lost faith. He had not, but because the loneliness had accumulated to a point where it had its own weight, its own gravity. He wrote about missing his parents, both of whom had died while he was overseas, and whom he had not been with at the end. He wrote about a moment in a hotel room in Guangzhou when he sat on the edge of the bed for what he thought was a few minutes and was still sitting there 3 hours later, unable to move, unable to pray, just sitting. He wrote, "I do not doubt him, but I am very tired of being alone." His younger brother traveled to Guangzhou and found him there. He had lost 30 pounds. He was suffering from what would later be identified as a severe depressive episode, complicated by physical exhaustion. His brother brought him home to Fujian, to the house where their father had eaten cold rice alone at that table in the dark, and Bo-wen slept for 3 weeks. He recovered, slowly, not completely. The Japanese invasion changed everything. When Japanese forces moved into coastal Fujian in 1938, the world Bo-wen had preached through for a decade began to come apart. Churches were commandeered, pastors were arrested. The networks of fellowship and accountability that had formed around the revival were scattered by refugees and soldiers and the general catastrophe of a war that did not care about the kingdom of God. Bo-wen did not flee. He moved inland with the refugees and kept preaching in whatever space was available. Abandoned warehouses, open fields, once famously in a bombed-out cinema with no roof in the rain, to an audience of 400 people who stood there for 2 hours getting soaked because they would not leave. He preached to Japanese soldiers once, through a trembling interpreter. He did not know until the next morning that 3 of them had become Christians before the regiment moved on. In 1941, a letter reached him. He was in Yunnan province by this point, far inland, informing him that the church in his hometown, the one his father had built, had been burned. He read the letter sitting in a courtyard. He folded it carefully and put it in his Bible, in the Book of Lamentations, where it remained for the rest of his life. Then he preached that evening. He was never quite the same after the war. He returned to the coast in 1946. He was 45. He looked 20 years older. The fire was still there. People who met him in those post-war years all said the same thing, that there was something in his eyes that made you feel like you were standing too close to something that was giving off heat. He preached. He prayed for the sick. There were still healings, but the body was exhausted in ways that rest could not reach. He developed tuberculosis in 1948. He recovered partially, then pleurisy, then a series of smaller illnesses that accumulated like a sentence that keeps adding clauses. He moved to a smaller city in Fujian and stayed there for the first time in 2 decades, in one place, in a room he could call his own, with a table and one chair. He wrote. He had always written sermons, letters, diary entries, but now he wrote with a different purpose, with the urgency of a man who knows the clock is running. He finished a memoir. He wrote a series of extended letters to young pastors across China. Letters so full of practical wisdom and hard-won understanding that they were copied by hand and passed from church to church for years after his death. He was not bitter. This is crucial. The man who had given everything and received loneliness in return, who had watched the revival he poured his life into get scattered by war and politics and the general disorder of human history. He was not bitter. He was clear. There is a difference. He wrote in one of those final letters, God does not owe you the fruits of what you plant. He only asks that you plant. The harvest is his business, his timing, his field. You are only ever the seed. He died on a Tuesday morning in March of 1952, in the room with one chair, with his Bible open on his lap and a cup of tea going cold on the table beside him. He was 51 years old. There was no crowd at the funeral. The political situation in China had made large public gatherings dangerous. 12 people came, former colleagues, a few old believers from the Fujian churches, his brother's family. They sang 2 hymns in the small courtyard of the house. Nobody counted the 40,000 in Fujian. Nobody counted the 11,000 in Singapore, the 16,000 in Malaysia, the thousands more in Korea, the Philippines, Japan. Nobody counted the churches that had been planted, the pastors who had been trained, the men and women who were alive in 1952 because the revival had reached them before the opium or the despair or the war could finish the work. Nobody stood up at that small funeral and said, "You are looking at the most important revival leader in 20th century China." Nobody knew yet. The records were scattered. The stories were in the memories of aging believers spread across 12 countries. The history had not been written. The room with one chair was very quiet. There is a question this story asks, and it is the same question that every story like this eventually asks. What is it worth? Bo-wen gave up the doctoral thesis and the career and the table with 2 chairs. He gave up sleep and health and a home and the chance to be with his parents when they died. He gave up the life that his brilliance had made entirely available to him, the life that his father had sacrificed to make possible. He gave it all to something he had found in a fever room in Ohio, something he couldn't prove and couldn't explain and couldn't put down. And in return he got loneliness, exhaustion, tuberculosis, and a funeral with 12 people. But he also got 40,000 in Fujian. He got the woman who walked out of a village hall in 1928, with her legs working for the first time in 11 years. He got the Japanese soldier who found something in a bombed-out cinema that he carried back into the war with him. He got 400 people standing in the rain because they would not leave. He got a letter in Lamentations and 3 weeks of sleep in his father's house, and the long, hard clarity of a man who has paid the price and knows exactly what he paid it for. He got to be a seed. The question is not whether the price was worth it. Bo-wen answered that question every morning for 25 years, and the answer was always the same. The question is whether you are willing to ask it of yourself. Because whatever God is calling you toward, whatever the secret place is asking you to give, whatever the revival in your own city, your own street, your own family needs from you, the price will not look the way you expect. It will not be dramatic in the ways you want it to be dramatic. It will be small and daily and unglamorous. It will be the table with one chair. It will be the cold rice in the dark. It will be the letter you put in Lamentations and the sermon you preach that evening anyway. Will you pay it? The cloud of witnesses is watching. The question is still open, and the harvest is still his business. But the planting, the quiet, costly, unglamorous planting, that is yours.